Here are the basics of hard ground etching. Starting with your piece of copper, measure carefully. Mark with your needle or a sharp X-Acto knife. Don't use a marker, it's just not accurate enough. So let's take our copper plate over to the cutter. Place it on the bed of the cutter, line it up, use the cardboard strip to protect your copper from the teeth on the cutter, and look in to make sure your mark is lined up with the edge of the bed. Next, watch your fingers, stand up on top and push. There's a nice clean cut. So now we need to polish the surface of this plate, remove some of the incidental scratches, and remove the grease. Water, powdered cleanser, and 4-0 steel wool will do just that. I use 2 pieces of steel wool to keep my fingers off of the bare plate if I can. You scrub for a couple of minutes and then rinse under the sink. Try not to touch the surface anymore because it should be free of grease. The water should flow off in a sheet. If you look at the back, it beads up. That means there's grease. But we're not worried about the back, only the front. Dry it carefully with a paper towel. Before you move to the next step, clean up your mess on the table with more water and the sponge. Now, if you were planning ahead, you would have moved over to the hot plate and turned it on before you even started cutting your copper. The hot plate takes 10 or 15 minutes to heat up. And we're going to apply hard ground with a roller. Place your copper in the middle of the hot plate. Let it get hot, 30 seconds or a minute, and then spread hard ground. Be careful not to use soft ground. They look similar, but they do different things. And now, with a slow motion, pressing down slightly, use your roller to spread that hard ground over the plate. This whole process should take you about 30 seconds or a minute. When you're done, carefully remove your plate, it's very hot, and place it on a glass surface nearby. Glass will pull the heat out of that copper and allow the liquefied hard ground to return to a solid state. Put away your bits and turn off the hot plate. Now, cleaning the roller is simple enough. Roll it over the surface of the hot plate. The heat will remove 90% of the ground from the roller. And then move into the cleaning station, check the instructions, and clean that roller. So we have a nice polished, degreased piece of copper with hard ground on the top and nothing on the back. The way that etching works is any part of the copper that's exposed to the ferric chloride, the stuff that we call the acid, will etch. So we need to protect the back as well. Here's where we use our Stickyback plastic. Cut a piece that's slightly larger than your plate. This will make it much easier. Lay that plastic sticky side up and then place your plate on top of it. You can use the old backing piece from your Stickyback to press down. And then carefully, with a sharp knife, run along the edges of your plate to trim off the excess. Your plate's now ready to receive drawing. Drawing on your plate, or imaging it, is really straightforward. Using your etching needle, and not a lot of pressure, you simply glide across the surface, removing that fine layer of hard ground. If you're encountering resistance from the copper, your needle might be too sharp or you're pushing too hard. You should be able to make really fluid motions with your needle, hatching lines, dots, to expose the copper below. Wherever you have exposed the copper, it will etch and eventually print. So drawing freestyle on the plate isn't everyone's style, and that's where we can use transfer paper. Transfer paper is kind of like a waxy carbon paper, and in this case it's white. And I'm going to use it to trace my drawing of a horse onto this grounded plate. So I place my transfer paper with the appropriate side facing down. I place my drawing on top, and then using a pencil, I can impart my drawing to the plate. It's important to know that tracing paper and transfer paper are not the same thing. We're using transfer paper. The other thing that's important to note is that when we pull the transfer paper away, we have a guide on the plate. None of this will etch, and it doesn't really affect things that it's there. You still need to use your needle to remove the ground that's below in order to have lines and marks that will etch and eventually print. Transfer paper is really handy. It can help you lay out your composition and ensure that you're going to draw where you plan to draw. But just remember, transfer paper provides a guide and nothing else. So here's my copper plate, and I've done all the drawing on it that I want. I've got some hatching there and so on. But I also have some marks on this plate that I don't want. So before this plate ever sees the acid, I'm going to use stop-out varnish. I'm over in the vented cleaning area where I can find the stop-out varnish and a brush. And then carefully, I will paint onto the plate anything that I would like to stop out. It's not erasing per se, but in this case, the marks that I've made have not yet been chemically etched in the ferric chloride, the acid. So I can cover them up with the stop-out varnish, which is basically a thicker, goopier, slightly smellier version of the solid hard ground, the ball hard ground that we applied on the hot plate earlier, to preserve the plate. There are all sorts of other neat things you can do with stop-out varnish, but for right now, we're just going to try to ensure that nothing on the plate etches that we're not expecting to etch. Once I've covered the plate up to my satisfaction, I'm going to move it over to the vented area and allow it to dry. Using a little bit of biodiesel, I can clean our brush on the newspapers, wipe it with a gray studio rag, and then using a shop towel and some simple green or roller cleaner, spray the tip of the brush, move it around, dry it, and put it away. So we're ready to etch the plate now. That is, dunk it into the tank of ferric chloride. Using some packing tape, tape the back of the plate to provide a hanger. Rather than lay the plate down in a tray, we're going to hang it in the tanks. And of course I've got gloves and a face shield on. The first thing I do when I walk into the room to use the acid, assuming that there's no one else currently etching, is to take the stick and mix the ferric chloride for 10 or 15 seconds, and then carefully lower my plate into the ferric, roll the tape over the hanger, and put the lid on. Here's a close-up look. The etching time for a standard hard ground line is 1 hour, but of course, less time will give you a lighter line, and more, a slightly more coarse line. Once my hour is up, with my gloves and shield on, I carefully remove the plate and rinse front and back and remove the tape. Dry it with a shop towel and move back to the vented cleaning station. So again, with some biodiesel and a gray studio rag, I can remove the hard ground and the stop-out varnish. Stop-out varnish is the same stuff, only much thicker, so it might take you a couple of minutes of scrubbing back and forth to remove it all. Then I'll move on to roller cleaner and a blue shop towel and finish with vinegar. What you should see now is a nice shiny clean plate and your design etched well below the surface. You may have other plans for this plate, you have other things you want to do to it, but it's basically ready to print with one last step. We need to bevel edges. Moving over to the power sander, we first put on our face protection, turn it on, and leaning your plate at about a 45-degree angle to the sanding belt and running along that bottom table, 2 to 4 trips across on each side without pushing too hard will provide an approximate 45-degree bevel. This bevel is important for wiping the plate and also to ensure that your plate doesn't cut the blankets when it prints on the press. You want to move the plate fluidly and not push too hard. The only way to know is to try it. Once you've done all 4 sides, your plate is ready to print.